The northern wind howls like a wild beast. Amid gray mist and silent drifting ice, Viking dragon ships tear through the waves, surging forward. Cracked wooden hulls, oars thrashing icy water, and on deck stand men clad in animal skins ice cold as steel, hands gripping axes and shields. There are no war drums, no shouted chants, only pounding heartbeats and a cold that bites deep into the bone. In these landings, the Vikings did not face enemies alone. They confronted storms, hunger, and death lurking at every turn. They fought in snow, slept on the sea, and ate things others would not dare to touch. And yet, strangely enough, it was from this brutal world that warriors emerged who were famed for their strength, toughness, and endurance so formidable that all of medieval Europe trembled before them. Why were their bodies able to withstand the cold, wounds, and endless campaigns? Why did the Viking spirit seem almost fearless, charging into battle with calm smiles? Was it genetics, diet, or was there something deeper, a belief system and a way of life that forged them into the war machines of the ancient world? Today, let us ride against the northern wind to uncover what truly shaped the terrifying physical and mental strength of the Vikings of old. In Viking Age Scandinavia, nature never played the role of a gentle caretaker. It was a silent yet ruthless adversary, present in every breath. Winter stretched on as if endless, ice and snow sealed off paths, the ground hardened like stone, and the sea was so cold and violent that a single mistake could mean death. In such a world, the human body had only two options: adapt or disappear. Vikings were born and raised within the grip of the cold. From an early age, they grew accustomed to stepping outside into biting winds, to plunging into seas that cut the skin like knives, to working even when their hands and feet were numb. There was no training in a modern sense, yet every day of their lives was a physical trial. Bodies that were weak, prone to illness, or unable to endure hardship rarely survived even the first winter, let alone many in succession. Over time, this environment became a brutal filter, preserving only those strong enough to continue living. The North Sea was the harshest training ground of all. Viking ships were small and exposed, offering little shelter. Rowers faced freezing winds and heavy waves head-on. Each voyage meant hours, sometimes days of continuous exertion while the body lost heat rapidly. Shoulders, backs, and arms were worn down by relentless labor, yet at the same time forged into dense, enduring muscle. This was not explosive strength, but long-lasting endurance, the kind that allowed them to keep rowing, to keep fighting, even when exhaustion threatened to break the body. Life on land was no gentler. Scandinavian soil was hard, the growing season short, and every task cutting wood, building shelters, hunting, storing food demanded real physical strength. Labor was not a choice, but a condition of survival. Those who could not work, who were slow or weak, became burdens in small communities surrounded by a hostile environment. And in a society where everyone had to contribute in order to survive the winter, selection happened naturally and silently. This very process of natural selection shaped generations of Vikings. With extraordinary physical resilience, without formal military training, the environment itself did the work. Each winter was a round of elimination. Each sea voyage was a test of limits. Those who survived were not only stronger, but also accustomed to pain, fatigue, and deprivation. Their bodies learned to conserve energy, endure cold and hunger, and recover under minimal conditions. More importantly, physical strength and mental resilience were inseparable. Growing up in a world where nature constantly threatened life, Vikings learned to accept hardship as normal. Cold was no longer an enemy, but a part of existence. This continuous collision between humans and their environment forged warriors of exceptional endurance, not because they were born strong, but because the North forced them to become strong or be erased from the flow of life itself. For the Vikings, combat did not begin on the battlefield. It began in the dirt yard in front of the house, long before a child was old enough to hold a real axe. In the coastal villages of Scandinavia, where cold winds lashed directly against the skin, children were not raised under excessive protection. They were thrown into the real world early, where bumps, scrapes, and pain were as ordinary as daily meals. Viking children's games were not childish by modern standards. They wrestled on hard ground, learning to throw one another using weight and balance rather than elegant technique. The falls hurt, knees bled, shoulders ached, but no one stopped simply because of pain. With each fall, the body learned how to absorb impact, how to rise more quickly, and most importantly, that pain did not equal defeat. As they grew older, weapons entered daily life as something entirely natural. Wooden sticks, practice shields, then real spears and axes. There was no clear boundary between training and real combat. Strikes, blocks, and shoves were repeated again and again in tight spaces. Amid heavy breathing and the smell of cold sweat, Viking bodies grew accustomed to bracing themselves, to taking direct hits, to absorbing shocks that traveled straight into the bones of the arms, shoulders, and chest. Every blow strengthened not only muscle, but also thickened their threshold for pain. The most frightening thing was not that they were strong, but that they were unafraid of being hit. When someone grows up accustomed to bruises, cuts, and even minor fractures, the natural response to an incoming blow is not panic or retreat, but to keep moving forward. This is the essence of the Vikings' legendary toughness. Pain did not make them hesitate, because it had become familiar, no longer something threatening. In training, competition was always present. Honor was tied to one's ability to take punishment, to not give up halfway. Being knocked down was not shameful. Staying down because of pain was unacceptable. This culture quietly carved itself into the Viking mind. The body may hurt, but the will must not break. Every bruise was a mark of growing up. Every blow endured a step closer to becoming a true warrior. When they finally entered real battle, Vikings carried a terrifying advantage. They had already endured more pain than most enemies could inflict in the opening moments of combat. The clash of shields, the jolt of blows against bone, the scrape of a spear across flesh, all of it was familiar. Trained from childhood, their bodies did not panic in the face of violence, and their minds were cold enough to keep fighting when others faltered. From this, the image of Vikings as strong, unyielding, and difficult to break was born. In the world of the Vikings, death was not a dark ending. It was a doorway, and beyond that doorway, according to Norse belief, lay Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, where warriors who fell in battle were welcomed not as the dead, but as honored guests. This unusual view of death forged one of the most terrifying sources of Viking mental strength. Valhalla was not open to everyone. Only those who died with a weapon in hand, facing the enemy without retreat, were worthy of entry. To a Viking, dying quietly in bed was not a point of pride. Glory lay in meeting death face to face, without fear, without pleading. Fighting was not merely about survival. It was a path toward the highest meaning a life could achieve. When a society believes that an honorable death is a reward rather than a punishment, human psychology changes completely. Fear, the force that usually makes people hesitate, begins to fade. The Vikings were not fearless, but fear no longer ruled their actions. Death was no longer an unknown abyss. It was a promise. Fall the right way, you would not be forgotten. Norse mythology planted this belief early. Stories of Odin, of Thor, of the Einherjar, warriors who fought each day in Valhalla, died, rose again by nightfall, and feasted endlessly were told beside the hearth during long, frozen winters. These were not just tales for entertainment. They carried a lesson repeated again and again. Pain and death were not things to avoid at all costs, but trials to be endured on the road to glory. Because of this, Viking toughness did not come from muscle alone, but from the mind. When a warrior believed his wounds carried meaning, that every blow endured brought him closer to honor and immortality in the memory of his people. His capacity to endure pain multiplied. Pain was no longer just a biological signal. It became part of the life story he was writing with blood and sweat. Religion and myth also enforced a harsh social code. A man who feared death and fled the battlefield did not merely fail in this world. He carried shame into the next. By contrast, a courageous death brought honor to family and bloodline alike. This invisible pressure weighed heavily on every warrior, forcing him to stand firm even when survival instincts screamed for retreat. In this world, Toughness was not emotional numbness. It was a conscious choice. The Vikings accepted pain and danger because they believed something greater waited beyond it. And it was this faith in Valhalla, in the order of the gods, that forged warriors of iron will. Men ready to endure, ready to fall, without losing their calm in the final moment between life and death. Viking warfare was nothing like the heroic songs sung beside the hearth. It was not glorious, not romantic, and certainly not fair. It was a cycle of sudden landings, swift raids, cold killing, and rapid withdrawal before the enemy could respond. In that reality, only two kinds of people existed: those who adapted to violence and those who were removed by it. Viking expeditions stretched across vast distances, from the North Sea to rivers deep inside continental Europe. Every journey was a gamble. They fought on slippery beaches in narrow villages, and on ship decks pitching violently with the waves. There were no orderly formations, no secure supply lines. Everything was chaotic, fast, and brutal. Anyone who hesitated, panicked at blood or screams, rarely lived long enough to make the same mistake twice. Constant warfare became the most ruthless form of selection. Vikings were not strong because all of them were powerful, but because the weak, the unsteady, and those who broke under pressure died early. Every battle was a filter. Every raid was a survival test. Those who endured years of fighting were bodies already accustomed to exhaustion, wounds, and lingering pain. They did not need to prove their courage. They simply had no other option. Real warfare also eroded emotion. To survive, a Viking had to learn to cut hesitation away when decisions were measured in seconds. Compassion and fear became liabilities. This did not turn them into monsters in a mythical sense, but into people shaped by violence. Brutality, in this context, was less a moral choice than a survival skill. Wounds were inevitable, but in the Viking world, injury did not mean permanent retreat. Those who could keep fighting through pain had a chance to live and to claim a share of the spoils. Those who fell too early were left behind. Over time, only individuals with exceptional tolerance, both physical and mental, survived long enough to become seasoned warriors. No training was harsher than real war. No lesson was more costly than watching a companion die at your side. It was this relentless chain of experience that forged Vikings into warriors, known for their strength, toughness, and cold resolve. Not because they were born that way, but because an ending war forced them to become so, or disappear from history without leaving a trace. When we look back at the image of the Norse Vikings, it is easy to be captivated by their massive physiques, blood-soaked battles, and a reputation for toughness that once terrified all of Europe. But if we stop there, we see only the rough outer shell. The truth is far more complex and far colder. Viking strength was not a gift from the gods, nor simply the result of innate aggression. It was forged through a long chain of harsh conditions, an unforgiving natural world, relentless physical labor, early exposure to hardship, constant warfare, and a belief system that taught people to view death through an unusual lens. Their bodies were hardened by ice and freezing seas, but it was their minds that kept them standing when the body had already reached its limit. Viking culture did not celebrate safety. It valued endurance, risk, and the willingness to face consequences head-on. This produced people with extraordinary resilience, individuals less shaken by pain and pressure, but the cost was equally clear: a society where violence became normal, where the weak had little room to survive, and where human lives often ended far earlier than we might expect. So when we say the Vikings were strong and unbreakable, it is not praise, it is a logical outcome of their world. They were not allowed to be weak. They were not allowed to hesitate. The world around them offered no alternative. Behind every fearless warrior stood a human being, shaped and hardened by environment, belief, and war acting together. And perhaps the most important question is not why the Vikings were so strong, but this: if we were placed in the same conditions, will we become more resilient, or would the same pressure break us instead?